The opening scene of the movie has Fanny stitching up a blanket in her sister's room. It's a windy day today, but Fanny's mother, Mrs. Braun, takes great care to escort the kids down the hill to the townhouse. The village is bustling with rowdy kids, brightening the dull skies outside. As Mrs. Braun makes her way inside with her kids, she's informed of Mr. Keats' absence. However, Fanny isn't spared of a male companion, to her displeasure. She's met with Mr. Brown, who attempts to shake her hand. She rejects his approach, calling him out for insulting her sewing work. He says he has no idea what she's talking about, but she continues with her jabs. She tells him his poetry is a load of rubbish. All it leaves behind is irritation. He's amused by her critique, and around a puff of smoke, he tells her Mr. Keats is too busy with his own poetry to join them. Having had enough of the childish squabble, Mrs. Braun tasks Fanny with bringing tea to Mr. Keats. Fanny makes sure her appearance is orderly on her way to his room, aiming to impress the young poet. She leans against his door after knocking, resulting in some tea spillage. Mr. Keats takes no offense to it, and she proceeds into his room like she's familiar with it. There's not a hint of shyness in her voice when she tells him about Mr. Brown's distaste for her critiques. You see, Fanny is here to offer her opinion on Mr. Keats' work, something Mr. Keats is aware about. In fact, he goes as far as calling her a spy. She tells him she's not interested enough in his character to spy on him. He switches the topic to something she's more keen on talking about: fashion. She points out all the flaws in his current getup, and he takes it in stride. He's impressed that she's sewn and designed her clothes herself. Mr. Brown enters the room, asking Mr. Keats if Fanny has managed to annoy him in the short time she's been there. Fanny fights back, telling Mr. Brown her dresses are worth more than all of his scribbles put together. Quite literally, since she actually makes money of them. Mr. Keats is amused with her feisty spirit. Fanny is as diligent as ever with her seamstress duty. The next time we see her, she's on her bed, making sure every single stitch she puts in is perfectly placed. Meanwhile, nearby in town, Fanny's brother, Samuel, is at the library. He's accompanied by his younger sibling, Toots, and asks for John Keats' poetry book, Endymion. The man working there tells him he hasn't heard any good reviews of that book. In fact, he's bought 20 copies, and hasn't managed to sell a single one. The little one takes it upon herself to brag about how Fanny knows the author, which is why they're buying the book. Her brother and sister return home, book in hand. Fanny opens the book to the first page and hangs it back to Toots, urging her to read. Toots is half a page in before Fanny asks her to stop. But it's not because she doesn't like the poem. In fact, she's more than eager to read the words herself. She's impressed, to say the least, with the young man's writing. The next time Fanny and John meet, it's at a ball dance. John watches her from the side, as though he were glued to the wall. Fanny informs Samuel of her desire to speak to Mr. Keats, and the boy quickly goes to fetch him for her. When John approaches her, he's met not with a greeting, but with his own words. She recites his poem aloud, and he asks her what she thought of the book. She tells him she wanted to love it, but her feelings about it aren't clear to her yet. It seems like a book that isn't easy to understand. He presses her to give a more thorough opinion. She tells him she's not skilled enough at poetry for that. He laughs, saying he hopes he could be skilled enough at poetry one day too. She tells him hope isn't enough to yield results. Practice might help. Practice is what helped her make the dress she's wearing to this very ball. She tells him her dance cards are full. She can't jot him down as next on the list to dance with. To no one's surprise, he tells her he isn't interested in dancing. Trying to figure out why he is reluctant to have some fun, Fanny asks him how his brother is doing. He's sick with an illness, like her father was. His brother isn't doing any better, unfortunately. Her father passed away when she was very young, and we can only hope his brother doesn't face the same fate. The news of John's brother upset Fanny, and the next day, we find her making a gift basket for him. She wants to comfort a suffering man, she says. After careful deliberation over the ribbon she wrapped around the basket, Fanny makes her way to the Keats residence, Samuel and Toots in tow. After some difficulty, she gets Mr. Brown to open the door for her. Mr. Brown monkeys around, quite literally, as Fanny takes a seat by John and begins a conversation. She tells him to try a biscuit, lest it be too dry for his brother. She brings up his poem book again, this time apologizing for not loving it. She notes, however, that the opening poem was perfect. John is faltered, and when she tries to leave, he asks her to stay and offer some inspiration. They have no prospects or hope at writing right now. Fanny, however, is having none of it. She leaves the house, but John follows her down the makeshift trail in the woods. He walks up to the trio, asking them if they'd like to say hello to his brother, whose name is Tom. On the way, he asks if she'd like to see the pond. He flirts with her, saying there are more paths in these woods than there are eyelashes on her lids. She tells him it's amazing that he's friends with Mr. Brown, given the man's stupidity. He asks her if she prefers dandy men who know every rule of etiquette. She stops in her tracks, offended, and he quickly asks for her forgiveness. It's a long walk to Tom's place, and when they make it, Fanny sees firsthand how bad his state is. He's burning with a fever, and the stench is pungent. Fanny regards him with pity, not disgust. They see each other again that night, at yet another ball dance. Fanny doesn't hesitate to approach John, immediately asking him about Tom. She's worried sick and wants to know if he's showing signs of improvement. He tells her it's no use worrying. The only thing Tom can receive now is love, not healing. After watching Tom converse with the poet, she enters a room with two women. They read out loud one of the reviews John got from a journal named Blackwood. The review is quite terrible, and Fanny wastes no time telling them it's off the mark. She compliments the opening, and the women ask if she knows anything about poetry. Soon, a man named Reynolds walks into the room. He has been defending John's work in light of the bad review. As he recites some lines from Endymion, Fanny tells him the lines are beautiful. Raymond is needed in the choir room, where men have gathered to sing. John is there too, leading the wonderful melody. In our next scene, the Braun family are putting on a dance number, obviously inspired by the singing they heard last night. While they dance, Fanny overhears tragic news. Tom has passed away. Fanny quickly gets to work, using clothes making as a way to cope with the loss. Though she barely knew the boy, his brief appearance in her life clearly touched her deeply. At the wake, Fanny listens to Mr. Brown talks with a heavy heart. She's prepared a present for John. It's a pillow slip she spent all night preparing, and John promises to use it for Tom's coffin. Before John leaves, Fanny invites him over for Christmas dinner. Her mother insists, too, but John has already promised to spend Christmas with the Reynolds family. Fanny is not happy about that, to say the least. Fortunately for her, she doesn't have to accept his rejection. The next day, she gets a letter from John, telling her he'll be there for Christmas. Christmas has come, and so has John to the Braun residence. She greets him warmly, and he soon finds himself next to the fireplace, cuddled up with a cat. Fanny starts the conversation with a strange opening. She tells him she was wondering if he was sleeping in her bed this morning. It turns out that when Fanny's family stayed at Mr. Brown's place in summer, Fanny had slept in the room John now sleeps in. As she sets up the table, she asks John to teach her poetry. She wants to understand it too. Dinner begins, and John runs through some traditional Christmas routines he knows. One of them includes vigorously stirring a teacup while watching him dance. As the night continues, John begins reciting poetry. He doesn't impress the table with his sad words. Instead, the women leave the room with a pitiful glance at him. He's left alone with Fanny and Samuel, the latter of whom is busy with his violin. Fanny, however, is subjected to John's gentle caresses of her hand. The next time Fanny visits the Brown estate, she makes a beeline for the office. She's here for poetry class, she declares, much to Mr. Brown's amusement. John begins the class by saying that poets are the most unpoetical thing in existence. A poet has no identity, instead opting to inhabit another body, the sun, or perhaps the moon. Mr. Brown hasn't let his pettiness go, and not even a minute into the class, he accuses Fanny of pretending to be into poetry. She tells him she's genuinely taken up the hobby, having had enough of his remarks. After Mr. Brown makes his exit, Fanny starts asking about poetry. John tells her he isn't sure he can teach her. His strange attraction for her is getting in the way, he fears. He tells her poetry is an experience beyond thought. It's not about knowing a lake, it's about experiencing the lake. Soon enough, Fanny begins spending her day with a poem book in hand. She tells her mother about John, complaining that he doesn't like her. Her mother tells her that John forbids himself from liking her because he cannot provide a life for her. Fanny's next visit to Mr. Brown's house has him interrogating her about the books she read this week. She's already been through a number of works, much to his surprise. She's also read all of John's works, reciting a few of his lines. They discuss poetry as they lounge, and for the first time, their conversation is amicable. It's pouring rain when someone comes around Fanny's house to deliver her a Valentine's letter. Toots hands it to her, and to her disappointment, she realizes that the letter is from Mr. Brown. Her mother sees John waiting in the garden and quickly informs Fanny, who rushes outside to talk to the man. When he learns that Mr. Brown sent her a Valentine, he's rightfully mad. He's only been away for 10 days, and Mr. Brown has already managed to steal Fanny from him. Though they are not together, John still feels a sense of deep kinship with her. He asks him if they are lovers, and it's obvious that he's envious of his situation. Unlike John, Mr. Brown has the finances to pursue and marry Fanny if he wishes to do so. Mr. Brown tells him the letter was just a joke. Fanny's flirtatious nature is also a joke, he says. Mr. Brown insists that she collects suitors, almost as though it is a game to her. All Fanny can do is stand there and listen to his false accusations. John is having none of it. He pushes him against a tree, telling him not to meddle with her heart's affections. John asks her if she's in love with Mr. Brown, and Fanny doesn't answer. As she walks away, Mr. Brown tells John she only knows how to flirt and sue. John tries to chase after her, but he's met with Mr. Brown's words coming out of Fanny's mouth. It seems that his unfair characterizations have finally gotten to her. The next time Fanny comes to the Brown residence, she brings with her tree branches littered with flowers. She doesn't speak, but Samuel informs John that they're moving in next door. The tension between the three is palpable, and John moves away from his spot at the doorway to distance them further from Mr. Brown. It seems as though John's affection for her has not waned. Later, Mr. Brown gathers around the Braun family and sets some ground rules. He tells them not to bother him or John when they lounge around the house. Chances are, they're writing poetry in their head. Fanny mocks his proposition, rightfully so. His thoughts are no more important than the thoughts the rest of the members of the house have. After the Braun family settles down in their bedrooms, John finds the room he thinks Fanny will be staying in. After knocking at her door and hearing her response, he realizes that they will in fact be sharing a door. He quickly works out a solution by putting up his dresser against the door. It's morning now, and Fanny is watching Keats through the window. He notices her stare, looking right back at her. In the next scene, they're walking through a busy park, clad in colorful clothing. They're talking about dancing, and the conversation is amicable and pleasant. They part ways with the rest of Fanny's family and take solace in a clearing nearby, wanting some privacy. It's clear that they've gotten the events that transpired due to Mr. Brown's letter. John tells her about the dream he had last night. She asks him if she was in his dream, and he answers her question with a kiss. They must have spent the next half hour kissing, because it's what they're doing when they hear Toots calling out for them. Their walk back involves them sneaking kisses behind Toots' back. It's a pretty silly sight amongst the blossom trees. Later that day, as Fanny lays in her bed, Mr. Brown, John, and Samuel attempt to find a nightingale nest. John climbs up the tree, eager to see if the claim that there is a nest is true. However, he gets distracted and lays on top of the tree's full branches. Later that evening, Mr. Brown and John discuss poetry, as usual. Mr. Brown thinks John's poetry has gotten much better these past few weeks. He also warns John not to get close to Fanny, lest he give up his freedom as a poet and become a working husband. John tells him the only reason he's writing so well these days is because of Fanny. If Brown's a true friend, he'll let John have this. Their summer days are spent leisurely, but productively, with John writing and Fanny sewing. One day, while John is reciting one of his poems to Mr. Brown, Fanny lets herself into the room. She listens to the writing with interest, after which John tells her he'll be leaving to Isle of Wight for a writing retreat with Mr. Brown. Fanny is devastated to hear the news, and she storms out. John meets her in the living room, apologizing profusely. He explains that he has to go and start making a living with his writing. Only then can he marry her. Fanny is in shambles, refusing his abandonment. She accepts him as he is, current financial situation and all, and she wishes he could see that. It's been weeks since John left for his retreat, and Fanny is deep in her depression. She even refuses to help her sister with her sewing. She spends her days laying in bed or sitting by the door, asking if John has sent a letter yet. The day she finally gets a letter, she's ecstatic. The letter is beautiful and details the beautiful scenery of the Isle. It also, of course, includes John's lengthy gushing about Fanny. From his beautiful poems, it's clear as day that the love she has for him is requited. The love spreads from the letter onto Fanny, and thereon onto those around her. She's as sweet as ever with her siblings, finally at peace, knowing that John loves her still. They spend the rest of John's stay at the Isle writing letters back and forth, exchanging words of adoration and devotion to each other. Meanwhile, Toots has taken to a new hobby, butterfly keeping. The room is swarmed with them, and though their mother doesn't like them, Fanny is too in love to care. She tells her mom as much, telling her that when she doesn't receive a letter from him, it's as if she no longer has life inside of her. Unfortunately, their letter exchange takes a devastating turn. It's been a while since Fanny has gotten one from John, so when she sees that his next letter is short and abrupt, she's in agony. He's in London now, and didn't bother visiting. He didn't make any money during his retreat either. Summer has gone and fall has taken its place, evidenced by the brown shades outside. Fanny's sadness is still there, and when she sees Mr. Brown again, he tells her John won't be coming back. There's a new maid in the house, Abigail. She talks Fanny's ear off as she sketches out some dress designs. At least she's gotten back into her hobby. To everyone's surprise, John makes a surprise visit to the house. Fanny greets him with a simple hello, handing him the necklace she wore around her neck. Their conversation is not friendly, much less romantic. He watches in silence as she unpacks his suit, staring at her with a downtrodden expression. But their bond picks up again quickly, and in no time, they're kissing in the middle of the woods. With what little money he gathered, he managed to get a ring, which is now on Fanny's finger. Her mother's friend talks to her about John shortly after. She tells Fanny that John is moving in next door. She reminds Fanny that he can't afford to marry, so she's rightfully shocked to see the engagement ring. Fanny pays her remark no mind, telling her that love is more important than riches. Fanny and John fall into a routine, with John writing alongside Mr. Brown and Fanny sewing. Mr. Brown leaves them some room, and the couple cuddle on the couch, exchanging sweet words and comforting hugs. Later in the kitchen, Mr. Brown is complimenting Abigail's cooking. Winter has come, and the snow is falling beautifully. Fanny is worried for John, who's gone to London without a cold. He comes back in the middle of the night, soaked in rain, cold to his bones. Mr. Brown alerts the whole house. They need to attend to John's condition immediately. Not only is he hypothermic, but his clothes are also soaked in blood. In the morning, Mr. Brown tells her that she can only visit John if he allows it. When she finally visits, John is in a terrible state, having coughed up blood, but she's happy to have seen him with her own 2 eyes. Despite John's slow recovery, he goes back to writing almost immediately. Though the two are next door to each other, sharing a wall, their imposed distance makes it feel like miles. Fanny's family forbids their marriage, and John thinks Fanny deserves better. The next time she visits him in the office, he tells her his disease is winning. Instead of addressing that, Fanny tells him his poems are the most beautiful pieces of writing she's ever read. They recite one of his poems, and his deterioration is evident. In the kitchen, Abigail is throwing a fit. She hands Fanny a letter Mr. Brown sent to her. What the letter holds is unknown, but Abigail insults his character severely. Apparently, Abigail is pregnant, but she believes Mr. Brown is the father. Mr. Brown denies it in his conversation with John. However, he has agreed to pay for the child, but he won't be able to house John any longer. He's drowning in debt, and he has to start charging rent. During a meeting the next day, a number of people talk about John's health. They tell him he should move somewhere warmer, maybe Italy. He won't have to worry about his finances, as the stay will be funded. They ask him to pick a travel companion. They'll depart for the summer. John has now moved out of the house, but Fanny still meets up with him. While on a walk, Fanny tells John she would like to go with him. He tells her he can't afford it and shows her the room he's staying in. It appears to be identical to the room his brother spent his last days in. Back at the house, Fanny's friend tries to comfort her about her situation with John. Fanny tells her she can't give up or forget the man no matter what. Much to our surprise, John shows up at the house. Toots finds him sleeping under a windowsill, and Fanny is greeted by a love confession when she wakes him up. He can't stand up or walk, needing to be carried into the house and up the stairs. A doctor comes to see him almost immediately, and Fanny gives him permission to stay the night. Fanny asks her mom if they can get engaged so she can leave to Italy with him. What she gets in response is her mom expressing regret for moving into the house. She tells her daughter that she's the talk of the town these days. When Fanny expresses her wish to get engaged again, her mom nods and caresses her arm before leaving without a word. During the next meeting with the other poets, John is told that the ship is leaving for Naples in 10 days. The trip is fully paid for, but it seems that Fanny won't be going with him. The family, alongside John, spend his last day at the house outside, dancing playfully. His cough hasn't gotten any better despite the doctor's visit. Later in the day, as Fanny packs John's suitcase, John signs some copies of his book. They're not selling well, but they got some good reviews. Fanny's mom seems to have come around, for she asks John to start living with them. He doesn't take her up on the offer, and later that night, he takes a locket of Fanny's hair as a keepsake. Fanny soon starts crying, lamenting the fact that they probably won't see each other again. He tells her he has no choice, the trip is already paid for, and his health is on a steep decline. He tells her they need to sever their connection for the good of them both. But she says she never will, he will stay in her heart forever. He tells her they can pretend he'll return in the spring, if it makes her feel any better. They start laying out a future where they're together. Even though it's only pretend, it makes both of them feel much better for just a little while. Fanny bids him farewell the next day, seeing him to his carriage. Meanwhile, Abigail has given birth. The baby has been claimed by Mr. Brown, thankfully. He tells Fanny John's ship has reached Naples. She asks him why he didn't go with John, and he tells her he needed to stay for the baby in-house. He also admits that he has failed as John's mentor. Later, Fanny gets a letter delivered by Toots. Their mother checks it for her. It's from John, detailing his stay in Italy so far. He loves it there, luckily. Meanwhile, in snow-capped England, Mr. Brown watches Fanny outside. He may be feeling some regret about their situation, since he has played a hand in it. One evening, as Fanny sews and her brother plays violin, Mr. Brown enters the room with a thud. Fanny's mother asks him if he has heard anything from John. With a heavy heart, he breaks the news that John has passed away on the 23rd of February. As he reads the letter from John's companion detailing his passing, Fanny leaves the room, sobbing. She falls to the floor, mourning her lover. She calls to her mother, telling her she can't breathe. She holds her daughter as she cries, trying to offer her some comfort in this terrible time. Fanny is dealing with the loss as best as she can. She tailors her black dress and gives herself a haircut before stepping out into the cold winter. She walks through the woods, reciting her late lover's poetry. It's as though she took it upon herself to share John's work with the world, now that he can no longer do it himself. The movie ends with some information about Fanny's life after John's passing. She was devoted to him for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, John's posthumous works became critically acclaimed. He is now known as one of the greatest romantic poets.